Chapter 11. Charleston House, London, England. May 29th, 1889. Easton was bent low over a row of bubbling test tubes. They took a small scraping of the mold from a sample dish and dropped it into a tube, not bothering to wear gloves. The two of them rarely did. Perhaps if something had ever gone wrong with their handling of substances, they might have started taking better precautions. But as it was, the two scientists were young, lucky, and foolhardy, and more than willing to cast aside standard safety measures. The chemicals they had dropped the mold into turned a deep, swirling purple as the spores dissolved. In all honesty, Easton had practically no idea what they were doing. Chemistry had never been their strong suit, beyond a few basic, more explosive compounds. The physics-based, engineering focus of science was always their main area of expertise. But, given their circumstances, they weren't going to pass up the opportunity presented to them by a cushy internship under the tutelage of Dr. Quakeson, especially when everything was fully funded by their eccentric sponsor. So it was, they found themselves here. What was next again? Easton sighed. Seven, who was quickly becoming a staple feature of the household, his novelty set aside by Sherbett's newfound interest in the mold, looked up from the corner of the room. Dr. Quakeson instructed you to test the compound's reactions to various chemical substances, in order of water, room temperature and boiled, hydrochloric acid. Yes, I have all that, thank you, Seven. I meant after I've jumped the spores into the various chemicals. Easton waved a hand, noticing briefly the edge of their fingers looked slightly darker than usual, almost purple, stained, it seemed, by the odd nature of the ingredient. They didn't pay much attention to it. It wasn't uncommon for Sherbet themselves to have discolored fingers from various chemical compounds, after all. Seven nodded. Ah. There was a grinding sound as Easton's response was processed in the unseen chambers of Seven's mind. Observe for discoloration, I believe was their instructions. Easton was growing quickly bored with observing for discolorations. For much of the time they had spent in the laboratory, they distracted themselves with a desire to open up Seven's metallic skull and finally discover what was making the automaton work. There were still so many questions about the impossible machine. Unfortunately, with everything going on, Easton hadn't got the chance. Immediately returning to London from Arboreal Manor, Sherbet had set all three of them working to try and extract the necessary components from the mold to create a cure for Dr. Morningstar. Days and nights of tireless work, studying the dark mildew. Not that Easton could bring themselves to complain, exactly. There was something almost magnetic about the substance. Something which drew them away from wanting to work on Seven, and focused their attention solely on its shifting violet hue, the swirling patterns it made in the water, let loose like droplets of ink, dancing while suspended in the liquid. The vision made their skin crawl, reminding them of an unpleasant dream they couldn't quite place. Only the night before, Easton had woken up in a cold sweat from a nightmare. It was not rare for them to have these unsettling dreams, but this seemed far more severe than normal. In their half-awake state, Easton found that the only thing that seemed to calm them down was returning to the study, tracing their way by touch through the dark halls and staring for a long time at the samples of mold contained within the jars. It had grown quickly, unnaturally so, in the days since Sherbet first received the specimen from Jamie in the mail. The purple fungus had entirely coated the inside of the sealed glassware it had arrived in. They had used a good amount of it recently in various experiments, burning it, dissolving it, pulling it apart chemical component by chemical component, until the stench of the fungus filled the entire house, attic to basement, and Easton could taste it long into the night, clinging to the walls of their throat. They were almost getting used to it by now. It was a welcome scent in Charleston House. The sweet, sickly rot of overripe fruit dripping from their walls. In a way, Easton was glad Sherbet had brought more of the sample back with them from David. It would be nice to have more of it in the home to add to the aroma. This line of thinking was, after all, purely coming from a scientific standpoint, of course. Sherbet was on edge as they stepped into the room. They used their handkerchief not to wipe their eye this time, but to mop sweat from their brow. It was certainly warm in the laboratory, with the open flames and boiling water, and the heavy, oppressive nature of the spore-ridden air. Only there was something more, too. A fever, Sherbet thought. Nothing more. a side effect of the last few sleepless nights working to save their friend. They could feel the sweat dripping down the back of their neck and soaking into the collar of their shirt. Sherbet swallowed and tasted the mold on their tongue. The scent of it in the air, the taste of it in their lungs, all of it so concentrated here in the lab, it was almost comforting. Sherbet's stomach riled, an instinctual rejection of this thought, a desire to leave the room before it seeped further into their skin. Sherbet ignored it. Their eye ached slightly, and they tried their best to ignore the pain. Why would they need to leave? Everything was perfectly fine. It was better than fine. They were making progress. Sherbet tapped their fingers on the desk beside Easton. Their apprentice failed to look up, transfixed on the bubbling purple liquid. "I am intrigued by its rapid growth," the chemist said, half to themselves, justifying the tests in their mind. "If those properties could be broken down, the cell growth, I mean, and transferred to the human body." Sherbet scratched their neck. It had been itching rather a lot recently, something they chalked up to the rising temperature of the London streets as summer approached. They were certain it was only the temperature, and not the dark bruising which seemed to be seeping slowly across their skin over the last day or two. It could be an amazing curative. Forget selling Charleston diluted opioids, we may have something real on our hands here. A cure sent to us by the grace of God. There was something in the back of Sherbet's mind that stirred slightly at the words. Something gentle but firm. Perhaps it was a voice, or maybe it was even as subtle as a guiding train of thought. Or a goddess, Sherbet breathed. Easton's eyelids were heavy as they looked up. Sherbet shook their head. "I was just saying that we might have something important here, is all." "I agree. It's fascinating," Easton smiled softly. A few curls of golden hair had fallen in front of their eyes, and the youth seemed to barely notice. "7, my good man, what might the time be?" Seven inclined his head. "Approximately 2:23 a.m. Easton turned to face the machine, their mouth fully open. "I'm sorry, Seven, you must be mistaken. It's only—" They pulled out a pocket watch. It was, in fact, well past 2 in the morning. "That's impossible. I could have sworn I only—" Once again, Sherbet's stomach lurched. Was this the first time they had let time slip away? It seemed to be happening to them more and more since collecting the spores from David, chunks of time going missing from their memory. At first, Sherbet had assumed it was just their lack of sleep, but now that Easton seemed to notice. "You should get some rest," they told Easton, leaning on the desk, watching as the oily liquid bubbled in front of them. But Dr. Quason, I could do more." Easton's eyes darted eagerly, almost hungrily, back at the mold. "In the morning. You're of no use exhausted. Good night, Easton. I'll wake you up if I discover anything important." "Feel free not to," Easton grinned in their usual attempt at humor, although there was something hesitant in their voice. Something false about the smile which tugged at their lips. They left the room without any further words, casting a final glance over their shoulder at the experiments taking place in their absence. Sherbet remained unmoving for a while, their minds still contemplating the strange gaps in their memory. Or perhaps that wasn't accurate. They were not gaps, more periods of foggy recollection, acting on the opposite of instinct while the mind was unoccupied. Actions which felt so foreign and unnatural to the body performing them that they veered right back around to the territory of perfectly normal. Yes, it was just the hazy memories of sleep deprivation. Sherbet was just tired. Perhaps they should get some sleep too. But not right now. Not when they were so close. Sherbet pulled up a chair by the desk and began following their hastily scribbled notes, trying to ignore the itch at their neck, which grew increasingly worse as the night went on. Sherbet wasn't sure what time it was when they cried successfully out into the night. Their pocket watch lay discarded in a pile of jackets and waistcoats on the floor, and Seven had long since been dismissed. It struck Sherbet now, as they held up the vial within their hands, that they were unsure how they had gotten to this point. Much of the night seemed in hindsight like a blur of automatic movements, shrouded in the intoxicating smell of mold. That warmth and fuzziness in the dark recesses of their mind. The chemist had watched as their hands had moved. They had felt as the ideas came to them, whispered in their ears in dry, rasping tones. Some of the mold had begun to bubble and creep out of the test tubes, seeping onto the wood of their desk, but it didn't matter. Throughout it all, Sherbet had done it. Clarified, purified, and extracted. In their hands, contained in the glass between their fingers, Sherbet held the cure. Not merely the cure for Ray, however. It would act as one, of course, counteracting the infection. But it was so much more. They were sure of it. It was, hissed a voice in the back of their mind, which with every whispered word sounded more like their own, the cure to all ailments. A substance capable of regenerating any damaged cells, of curing anything. They could test it. Test it to see if it would stop their eye from bleeding. Sherbet blinked at the purple liquid. It warmed their fingers through the thin glass of the test tube. This thought was their own. It was not the comforting other voice in the back of their mind. For the first time in hours, this idea had come to them solid and fast, a lightning strike of inspiration. This could be the end of the physical nuisance that had plagued them all these years. It was just a sip away. If they had looked up, even the slightest bit, they would have seen it in the window. Their own visage reflected back at them in harsh clarity. They would have seen the sheer amount of their flesh that the mold had latched onto in these last few hours. Sherbet would have seen the purple lines stretching across their skin, tentacles of violet, discolored veins inching up their neck from beneath the collar of their shirt, strangling them from beneath the skin, pulsing with a fetid excuse for blood. Sherbet did not notice, however. Perhaps, this far into the night, they wouldn't even have cared if they had. This was it. The culmination of years of research. The reason they had gotten their doctorate. The reason they had followed their father's footsteps. This was the thing that could help them. Help the world. The scientific discovery whose brink they had teetered on the edge of for years, and which was now spread out before them in a series of dark, vivid test tubes. The culmination of their research. The termination of it, in a way. The end. That was the thought that bounced inside of Sherbet's mind. The final grasp at consciousness before they lifted the test tubes to their lips and drank the purple liquid. The burning flooded over Sherbet in waves, causing them to cry out in agony as they braced themselves against the desk with one hand, gripping the test tube tightly with the other. It felt as if every inch of their body was on fire. The mold was spreading, seeping through their veins and digging into their lungs. Or perhaps it was being purged, they hoped desperately, burning away as the cure coursed through the scientist's body. Their bones ached, shifting and cracking with every shaky, spasmed movement which racked their body, skin being pulled taut across their breaking frame. Their heart felt desperate to burst from their chest, hammering against their ribs. The voice was louder now, and had lost its comforting edge. It was so loud that Sherbet could no longer register it as coherent thoughts or words. It was merely screaming. Brilliant, triumphant screaming. The joyful cries of something far beyond them. A being far removed from their understanding. A goddess. And then there was another voice. Another voice, its foreign sound rolling over the first, crashing over Sherbet's body and robbing them of the comfort the cries had brought them within the pain. The chemists couldn't bring themselves to reach for support as their legs gave out, buckling beneath them as they collapsed to the ground, shuddering violently. They couldn't bring themselves to do anything, to open their eyes, to think, even to cry. The Test tubes shattered in their hand, leaving their fingers bloody and covered in glass shards, but they didn't care, pressing their ruined hands against their ears as if to try and shut out the noise. It didn't work. Nothing would work. The two voices, if they could be called voices, seemed to beat Sherbet into the floor, driving them further into unconsciousness as they fought on a battlefield beyond recognition. Were the voices fighting for them? For their mind? Perhaps Sherbet's fight was the only real one. The fight to stay alive, the fight to stay awake, to stay in control of their own body. The second voice became louder than the first, a deeper, almost rushing sound like gale-force winds. Sherbet lost the fight and slipped away into the dark, calming recesses of their mind as their body shifted, broke, piece by piece, becoming something else entirely.